Hi. After having paid the AV tax for a while, I'm ready to go. My name is Dave Lebling, and I was one of the original implementers, as we called them, of the Zork game on mainframe. I was one of the founders of Infocom, which took Zork commercial a few years after we finished it as a hack project. And I worked for Infocom for a long time, too, and wrote, I believe, 9 games, or co-wrote 9 games. So I'm here to talk about Zork, though, mostly, which is, I think, for me, the most fun part of our time at Infocom and before that. So here I am. Now, for those of you who don't know what a text adventure is there anyone who doesn't know what a text adventure is? Yeah, come on, come on. Admit it, admit it. OK. A text adventure is a game you play entirely by telling the computer what you do, and the computer tells you what happens. It's kind of like playing D&D, except with somebody, a DM who's really stupid. But a DM who's totally without any qualms about killing you all. Oh, wait a minute, that's a real DM, isn't it? Anyway, so here are the people who wrote the mainframe Zork, the original Zork. We were all at MIT. I was a research staff member. Mark and Tim and Bruce Daniels were grad students and hangers-on and things like that. And the way Zork started is really tied a little bit into its time, which was the late 70s. And the late 70s were kind of like today in some ways. We have Downton Abbey. They had Upstairs, Downstairs. We have 12 Years a Slave. They have Roots, so forth and so on. Star Wars both times. Star Wars came out during the month in which we started working on Zork, the original Star Wars. Now, where did this happen? This happened at MIT, at the Laboratory for Computer Science, sometimes called Project Mac. It was, as you can see, a rather sort of post-brutalist kind of architecture. But we had a nice set of offices on the 2nd floor, and on the 9th floor were all our computers. And the 2 gentlemen in the middle there are JCR Licklider and Al Veza, both of whom went on to be on the Infocom board, and Al actually worked for Infocom as CEO for a while. So they were, respectively, a former DARPA program manager, that was Lick, who had foreseen the internet way back in the early 1950s, and Al Veza, who was a huge proponent of the ARPANET when it actually became a real thing. And he was our group leader. Now, those are the tools we had. A couple of mainframes. We had a PDP-10. That actually is the PDP-10 that was at Stanford back then. And it was enormous. It had 2 megabytes of memory. It was enormous. And disk space, huge amounts of disk space. I think we had, it was either 3 or 4 RPO4s with 92 megabytes each, and 1 or 2 RPO6s with 178 megabytes. We had acres of computing. Oh, and the thing down in the lower right is a terminal. It actually is about the size of a desktop PC, but it was our terminal to talk to the mainframes. And all of Zork and many of the Infocom games later were developed on those terminals. Now, this was the internet. The ARPANET, the network. That's a map of it. It could not have more than 255 hosts because the IP address was 1 byte, and 0 was reserved. We were in the upper right of the map there, the little dot labeled IMP6, I believe. And off it is a PDP-10 that was our machine, which was called MIT-DM. Now, the way we talk to it is through a router. That's the big white thing. It was a mil-spec router. And you could drop it from a helicopter from 20 feet, and it wouldn't break. It, in fact, even had hooks so that you could pick it up with a crane and drop it just to test it. And the thing on the right is another sort of router that people could dial in with a modem. And that is how the user community of Zork came to be. There were people all over the internet, which extended, notionally at least, from Hawaii to London. But people could come in over these phone lines and then telnet to our machine. You know, telnet still exists. And so that's how we got our user community once we started writing. Now, why did we start writing Zork? This is not the most legible of slides, and I apologize, but this is my personal map of adventure. Adventure was the father of us all. It was originally written by Will Crowther, who was a guy at BBN, which is now part of Raytheon, and they were the implementers of the internet. They created that machine that you could drop from a helicopter, and Will Crowther wrote a bunch of the software for it. He also wrote the first part of Adventure. And then a few years later, Don Woods found it and said, oh, this is really awesome, but it's really just crawling through a cave, which in fact it was. It was crawling through Colossal Cave in Kentucky. Actually, I think the official name of it was Bedquilt Cave. And if you ever manage to go to that cave, which some people have done, they report that it is exactly like that part of the game. So all the parts of Adventure that describe caves are real-life descriptions. Now, Don was more of a game type, and so he said, this is cool, but I want to do fun stuff. So he started putting in treasures and enemies and puzzles and magic words and all elves, cheering dwarves maybe, anyway. And anyway, it made it a more fun game, and it was like 400 points or something. And he wrote it in Fortran, and he let it get out on the internet. And for 2 weeks, well, on the ARPANET, and for 2 weeks, all work on the ARPANET stopped. And we were among those who stopped. And so being at MIT instead of Stanford, we felt that this was a wonderful game. It was a wonderful, wonderful game, but it had some defects. For one thing, it had a two-word parser. You could only say, you know, take axe, throw axe. You know, you couldn't say something like, put the sandwich in the lunchbox. It wasn't that good. And it had no adjectives. It had, you know, it just was imperfect from our point of view. And furthermore, it wasn't written in a modern language from our point of view. So we said, we're going to do something better. We have to do something better. The honor of MIT is at stake. Not to mention it would be fun. So we had some experience with games. We had created a game called Maze that was really the first-person shooter in some sense. You wandered through a maze. You fired at your friends and killed them, or you fired at monsters, well, robots, and killed them. That was on a smaller machine called an IMLAC. There was a game called Hunt the Wumpus, which we did, and then there was a crowdsourced trivia game, which was the reason why all these people on the internet knew to come to our site to look for interesting things. They had all come in to play trivia, and when Zork appeared, they came in to play Zork. So we sat around for a while saying, you know, we should do this, and nobody really was ready to quite bell the cat. And so I said, damn it, we're going to do this, and I'll start. So I wrote a two-word parser, and then I went on vacation. So Mark and Tim and Bruce sat down and started fleshing out what the world should look like in such a game. And they did a sample game, a sort of four-room game that's unfortunately now lost forever. Not that it was a great game. And the reason there is a bandstand there is one of the puzzles involved putting a band in a bandbox. And when you put a band in a bandbox, it played Hail to the Chief, because this was early '77, and Carter had been inaugurated as president just a few months ago. And that was one of the more exciting puzzles in the game. But notice, put band in bandbox, three-word parser. So again, this is another slide that's not super easy to read. But this is Mark Blank's early notes, and I think some of Tim Anderson's on top of them, about the beginning of Zork. And you can see a few rooms there in the middle. There were a few puzzles. The troll, a Cyclops, who, because Mark had seen 7 Voyages of Sinbad but not read the Odyssey, I guess, was scared by the word Sinbad rather than Odysseus or Ulysses or whatever. There was the thief that became Tim's obsession, who wandered around the whole universe of Zork, looking for you, stealing things from you, messing up the classic let's solve a maze thing, where you drop an object on the floor, because that'll mark the room, because mazes are all alike. The echo room was put in, and there were pits in the dark. If you walked around in the dark, you would fall in a pit. And so one of the very first things that happened when I came back was I started playing this alpha of the game. And so I said to myself, okay, let me wander around. And I went up in the attic of the White House. And it said, it's dark. I hadn't taken the lamp, and it said, it's dark up here. You could fall in a pit. And sure enough, I fell in a pit. And so I walked across the hall to Mark, and I said, Mark, I fell in a pit in the attic. And so he said, okay, do something about it. And so I sat down and I said, okay, well, there's a monster that gets you in the dark then. So I invented grues. And they are, I guess, one of the more iconic things from Infocom. I stole them from Jack Vance, a science fiction writer, or at least the name. And in French, it means crane. So the first time I went to Montreal, I saw all these signs that said, grues for rent, grues à louer. Really? and I thought Canada was laid back. I guess it's not. So this is kind of a sketch of the kind of things we could do with the parser. This is a later syntax. This is the ZIL syntax for doing, for parsing sentences. And the idea was that the verb put could be used in an enormous number of different ways. You could put an object in an object. You could put it on an object. You could put it down, which was similar to dropping it. You could put it under an object. You could put something out, put a fire out. So put was there in a lot of places. And then over on the right, you see the real verb it maps into for each one. And so when somebody types a sentence in, it maps, in this case, into putting, a gold key, handles adjectives, put in, and then in the wooden box. And that's kind of, like 2% of what the parser does, but it's kind of cute. And then behind the parser was what was the main loop of the game, which is read in an utterance, parse it, then give it to somebody else to work with. So the first person that got a chance to work with it was the so-called actor. Now, you're usually the actor. That means the avatar that's currently running. But sometimes it can be another creature, because eventually we got to the point where you could say things like, robot, walk east. Robot, take the cage. Robot, do this. And in that case, the robot would be the actor, and there would be special actor code that would make the robot be able to do things. And if he did it, you were done. Otherwise, it went on to the vehicle you were in, because we had vehicles, most famously the inflatable boat that you used to go down the frigid river. Then if that doesn't handle it, you give it to the so-called preverb, if there is one for the verb. Take just checks the take bit for the preverb. And then there's the indirect object can handle it, so the wooden box in that previous slide could handle it. Or the direct object could handle it. And then, it sort of just keeps going on there. And then eventually it gets to the so-called daemons, which are timer things. You could have timers like, in 5 moves, the bomb goes off. Or in 5 moves, the match goes out. Or in 3 moves, and then 3 moves after that, and 3 moves after that, something happens. Or every move, the thief does something. And this is someone, I honestly don't know who it is, out on the internet who did a complete map of Zork. And this is for the mainframe Zork. It's got everything in it, the so-called Chinese puzzle in the upper right, the volcano, in the middle left, the frigid river, the reservoir, the maze, just everything you could possibly want in a mainframe Zork. And this sort of was from the point where we were nearly done with it. So actually, let me, there's one thing I want to talk about, which was design, which was a word we didn't really know. And I've got a little video here of Mark Blank talking about how it all happened.
When the game was first being written, we had no, just like the original adventure, it had no real story. I mean, it had a place and things to do. But they were not at all tied together. There was no intention to tie them together. It was all different pieces of fun that you could do in any order. There was very little in the way of you have to do this to do that. There became more of that. And as the game got fleshed out, it was like, oh, we can hook this up to here, so where you end up at the end of this puzzle is actually here. And ooh, that's clever, so now there are different ways to go. But none of that was planned in terms of, oh, we've got this strategy, and we're going to build these areas, and you go from here to there. I mean, it all kind of happened.
And he's really understating it a little bit. What really happened a lot is that someone, and that was more often than not Mark, would come up with a cool idea for something to do. And one of the first ones he came up with was vehicles. He said, oh, you should be able to have vehicles. You should have boats and cars and planes and trains. You should be able to get in a vehicle and do something. And that just complicated everything, because especially when you have something like a portable vehicle, like the inflatable boat, you could take it somewhere that it wasn't intended to go, and you could try to use it. And just all kinds of unintended consequences would jump out. And so we would run around fixing all the unintended consequences, and then Mark would say, oh, you really ought to be able to talk to other characters and do something like that. You know, order them around. That would be fun, too. And so he created a robot that you could order around. And it turned out that that had complications elsewhere in the game, because there were other characters, like the thief. Didn't want to be able to order the thief around. That would be fatal. So just every time we turned around, someone would come up with an idea. I came up with sort of having D&D fighting in it, and that had its impacts. And just everything that we came up with made more work for us. And after a while, we started going, oh my God, this is really difficult. Now this is my final Zork map, and it's too big to show really on one screen, so I'm going to try to scroll it down here, which is a little bit slow, but it might work. Whoops, goes back. Never mind. There we go. Okay, I guess it got all the way up. Yeah. And one of the things you'll notice about it that I found kind of interesting when I was looking at this again is that it's all very flat. Even though the game was up and down, you could actually map it flat. And when I think of later games like, well, EverQuest or the various shoot-'em-ups, which have many vertical levels that actually interact with each other at different points, that was something we didn't do very much. But this is an interesting flat environment, but with lots of stuff in it. It was close, I think it was like 200 or 250 rooms by the time we were done. So about the same time, but somewhat unrelated to Zork, we were founding Infocom. This is 5 members of the board of directors of Infocom. Mark Blank is on the left, Joel Perez, who later became president, Alan Lick, and Chris Reeve, who was the guy who wrote the Muddle compiler. Muddle was the language we wrote Zork in, the modern language. And he wrote the compiler, and he wrote and maintained the interpreter, and was just, the guy for all of that hairy stuff. And when we started Infocom, we thought, what should we do? And the idea of doing something with Zork kept coming up. And it was like, yeah, we should do Zork. Zork would be cool. And then we would say, but it's too big. It's a meg. It's a whole meg. How can we possibly fit it on a micro? Because here's what was there for micros then. TRS-80 Model 1, 32K of memory. Apple II, 32K of memory. About 100K disks, more or less. So that doesn't divide well into a meg for one game. So we kind of put it on the back burner for a while. And in the meantime, Joel had gone out to Pittsburgh to work in his family's business, and Mark had finished medical school and was starting an internship in Pittsburgh. So they were both in Pittsburgh. And since both of them were bored by what they were doing, they spent a lot of time going to lunch and having Chinese food and talking about what they could do with Zork to put it on a micro. And so I'm going to show another little video here about how you have fun in Pittsburgh.
Zork came around on the mainframe, and it was well over a megabyte. And the machines we were looking at, besides Joel's PDP-11, very few people had PDP-11s at home, but Joel did. But the other machines that were out there then were Apple IIs and TRS-80 Model 1s. And those were machines that had floppy disks with 80K on them and maybe 32K of memory. So we were thinking about how this might be done, and we actually came up with an approach that was based loosely on what the researchers at UCSD did.
I had been playing with UCSD Pascal, which was an implementation that used threaded code where reasonably high-level instructions were encoded down into 1 or 2 bytes so that you could have a fairly complex program that actually took up very little space.
They invented a language that was portable, that was machine independent, by basically coming up with machine independent instructions that would then be interpreted on different machines to actually execute the code. This turned out to be a fabulous kind of idea, and nowadays the concept is used all over the place. Java being a good example of a language that's done exactly that way, and for similar reasons. But it was extremely slow and painful because, again, rather than running on these slow machines to begin with, and I'm talking about on bigger machines, on PDP-11s and PDP-10s, I mean, the problem is, now you had not only these slowish machines you're dealing with, but now you're interpreting a language on top of it. So you've added another layer of performance hit on that. So using that approach of just using UCSD Pascal, we were thinking that's just going to be horrible. But we had the idea that if we wrote our own language, our own virtual machine language, where the instructions of the language themselves, of the language itself, were very tied to the game. In other words, we weren't writing a general purpose language. We're writing something to run Zork. And so an instruction in this language, rather than add two numbers, although we did have one like that because we had to keep track of scores, for instance, might be move an object from this place to that place. And that would be literally 3 bytes in the game, which is very, very small. There'd be a byte, 8 bits, that would say it's the move instruction, and there'd be a byte that said it's this object, and a byte that said it's going to that place.
By encoding the code like this, you could actually just create a fairly small interpreter that would take each of our own codes and interpret it for whatever machine it happened to be running on. So that suddenly solved the problem of deciding whether we're going to support the Apple II or the TRS-80 Model 1 first, or in fact the PDP-11. We could fairly easily do all of them at the same time.
So a tiny little bit more detail about that. You could have 255 objects, which included all the rooms as objects. You could have 230-something global variables, things like the score that Mark mentioned. You could have 30 bit flags, things like, is this a lit room or an unlit room? You could have 31 properties, things that could be changed, things like weight and the descriptor sentence that you gave when the object was first encountered. And you could have 64K of static code and it was static because a 32-bit machine and a game that was 64K of code and another 20K of non-code, volatile stuff like not strings, but things like variables and stacks and the interpreter on a 100K disk. All of that couldn't possibly fit. So we did dynamic paging as needed. Every time a routine was called, it said, is it in memory? And if it wasn't, it would pull it in off the disk, which was kind of cool on the Apple II because you'd be playing on the Apple II, and if everything was in memory that you were doing, it was very quiet, the disk wasn't doing anything. Then you would do something, and the disk would start going. And that could either mean you were in really good shape or you were about to die. So the next step after this was for them to convince the rest of Infocom that this is what we wanted to do. This was not terribly difficult, since between the two of them, they owned 40% of Infocom. And once you add in me and Tim and a few other people, it was easily 50%, but it was not even that hard. People thought, hey, this could actually work. And so we set about doing it. And the first thing we did is we started to create a tool chain. And originally we had the model language with some additional macros, and we called that ZIL. That was the language that we wrote in. And on the other end, there was assembly code that would be run by those interpreters that Joel was talking about. And you'll see that in the second slot there's a thing called a compiler. We didn't have that initially. But if you look at Zoll code into assembly code here on the two sides, you can see they look moderately similar, but the assembly code looks like assembly code. And we didn't want to write assembly code. Assembly code's terrible. It's disgusting. And so because we were so incorrigibly lazy, we decided we had to have a compiler. And so Mark wrote part of it, I wrote part of it, Joel wrote part of it. Suddenly, there was a compiler, and it meant that you could write in the ZIL and not even have to look at the assembly code, except just throw it at the assembler and then run it, which was great. It meant much faster turnaround for bug fixes and stuff, not to mention we didn't have to learn a new language. And this is examples of muddle versus ZIL objects, because the original mainframe Zork was written in muddle, and that's the stuff on the top, and ZIL is on the bottom. The major thing you see that I just wanted to point out is that it's a little cleaner looking. That's about it. But it also looks a little like XML, or maybe, I don't know. It wasn't. So we said, we want to publish this. Well, we don't want to publish it ourselves. That's terrible. That would be no fun at all. We did publish the PDP-11 version, which I think sold 20 copies, 30 copies, I don't know, some small number. Not many had PDP-11s, as Mark said. But we wanted a real publisher, and Personal Software looked like a great bet because we knew some of the guys there. They liked Zork, the mainframe Zork, and they had a big success releasing a thing called VisiCalc, which was the first microcomputer-based spreadsheet. We thought, and they had also some games. They had a version of Adventure out, so we thought they were great. They would be great. So we went to them. We brought an Apple II or maybe TRS-80 version over to their offices, and they tested it because they knew how to play it. And they said, "Hey, this is just like Zork. That's awesome, and we'll publish it." So this is what they did for the cover. And we said, you know, that doesn't look like us. That cover doesn't look like us. For one thing, we never, ever in the game described who you are, what you look like, what sex you are, what race you are, whether you're fat or thin, rich or poor. You know, well, scruffy, I believe, was occasionally used. But we never did anything more. And here we've got Conan here, with a sword and a troll and all that kind of stuff. It didn't quite do it for us. But we didn't want to publish. And so they put out the TRS-80 and Apple II versions and it sold reasonably well. But then VisiCalc took them over, and here are some screenshots, but what happened to them is VisiCalc took them over completely. They eventually changed the name of the company to VisiCorp, and when the time came to do the next game, they weren't that interested. Here's the Zork users group map of Zork I. Mike Dornbrook, who later came to work for Infocom and was our first tester of the Zork I game, said, you know, the first thing you do in these games is you draw a map. Maybe I should give them maps. And you know, maybe they'd pay for them. And maybe I should give them hints. And maybe they would pay for that too. So this is the Zork users group Zork I map. And you can, if you were a careful student of one of the previous slides, you would see that what's in this is a big chunk out of the middle of the mainframe game. It was 40 to 50% of the mainframe game. We couldn't fit it all, which left us room to do other games. And it became Zork I. I think I was the one that actually sat there with the map. Probably it was a copy of my map, and I just sort of did a big circle and said, okay, that'll be Zork I. And it turned out to be pretty close. And this is, again, not a terribly readable slide, but this is an InvisiClues hint book, which is another thing Mike did, where you had a developer marker that would answer your questions about puzzles until finally the last answer was like the complete spoiler thing that would do it. There's subtle hints, less subtle hints, and then an abject spoiler. So I was talking at the fast forward, somebody said, well, are you going to talk about what you did wrong and what you did right? And I said, oh, really? Yeah, I guess I should a little bit. But this is kind of what we did right and wrong with Zork I. The parser was right. The Z machine was right. Having a tool chain was right. The size magically came out just right. And some of the puzzles, and this is personal opinion, were great. There was the thief. There was a puzzle where you had to bring light into a dark room that I thought was really good. There was flood control dam number 3, which was one of my favorites. And the famous inflatable boat, which had the great feature that here you've got this pile of plastic, and you recognize eventually, if you're lucky, that it's an inflatable boat. And you blow it up, and you put things in it. And when you're done putting things in it and sailing down the river, you disinflate it. And suddenly it becomes a bag of holding from D&D, because the inflatable boat and the uninflated boat were different objects. So all the objects that you had put into in the inflated boat were not part of your weight. Weren't encumbered, any of that silly D&D stuff. And you could walk around with the uninflated boat and go anywhere. And then when you reinflated the boat, all your objects were back. So it was a bag of holding. I thought that was pretty cool. What we did sort of wrong is this was a midnight programming project. We didn't design anything, you know. We just had fun. Pure dungeon crawl. Yeah, pure dungeon crawls are great. Some people, they're kind of passé today, but it was fun. There were too many puzzles that were magic words, and I kind of blame Adventure because it had a bunch of those too. There were puzzles that you just had to say the right magic word. Like to scare the Cyclops away, you had to say Ulysses, and the Cyclops would run away. Now, we mitigated that later by having alternate solutions to some of those more silly puzzles. And we killed you a lot. I mean, we were bad. We killed you altogether too much. Graham Nelson, I think it was, who has written a lot on adventure gaming, said, Zork hates its player. And there were ways to get stuck. You know, you use something that you need later, or you go somewhere and you can't get back to the other place. We were learning how to write adventure games, and it took a long time to learn to do them better. So then came Infocom as a publisher, because Personal Software got sucked into VisiCalc, and they said, games, no. We're gonna do Visi stuff, Visi databases, Visi editors, Visi party planners, Visi everything. And so they even changed their name to VisiCorp. And they decided, we don't want to do another game. We don't want to do Zork II. Forget it. We're not interested. And so we said, well, who's going to do it? Well, we're going to do it. So the very first thing we did is we found an ad agency that shared our sensibilities artistically, I guess you could say. And we raised some more money to pay for being a publisher and pay for them. And the very first thing they did was redesign our logo to the logo that was what we had until, I guess, Activision changed it after they, you know, in the dim and misty, horrible future. The company was called Giardini Russell, and these are some of their sketches for possible logos. Not as good as the one they finally came up with, but I liked it. And this was the original package. You think, wow, that's not very interesting by today's standards, and it isn't. But in those days, most games were sold either in baggies or sometimes in boxes. Small, you know, boxes that just basically held the manual, and you lifted the top off or you put it back on. They were not very exciting, and the stores didn't like them too much. So this was lovely blister pack. You couldn't get in it without making it obvious. It was beautiful. It was the look of Zork and Infocom forever after that. And we redid Zork 1, well, actually, we redid Zork 1 from the Barbarian to this, and loved it much more than the Barbarian. And we did Zork 2 in the same style. And Mike Dornbrook reminded me that we actually put them in a Zork 1, Zork 2 counter display that could be in a store at the same time. So Zork 2 was, in theory, everything else left over from Zork 1. That was the goal. And you can see, if you look in the far left, all the things with stars were taken from the mainframe game but hadn't fit in Zork 1. As it turned out, a couple of them ended up getting pushed yet again to Zork 3, but that was pretty much it. And these are my design notes for writing Zork 2. I mostly worked Zork 2 during that period, and Mark worked Deadline, which was our first mystery game, but he helped a bit on Zork 2. And came up with something new. The idea was, okay, Zork 1 was totally a dungeon crawl. Let's do something a little bit more interesting. So there was this character called the Wizard of Frabaz, and it became the goal of the game not to crawl the dungeon and collect all the treasures, but to find a way to stop him from annoying you, and in some cases he could actually kill you if you weren't careful, and get rid of him. So the dungeon crawl part of the game became a subset of defeating the wizard, which was in some sense an advance in the world of of narrative and story. A little advanced, but in advance. More design stuff. There's the infamous diamond maze, which I created, which required specific baseball knowledge that most Americans don't even have, and people who aren't Americans kind of go, "What the hell is going on?" So that was one of my triumphs in puzzle design. And another exciting puzzle in Zork II that Mark wrote.
We were trying to come up with a different type of puzzle than find the key to the door, which is what most of them were, whether it was a key or it was a button or it was something. You'd find something in one place and you'd take it someplace else and you'd use it. So they're very mechanical. I think for the Bank of Zork, the key was that the puzzle was about the way you would move, had something to do with what would happen afterward, not something you had. So the idea is we were trying to come up with, or I was trying to come up with a puzzle where to figure it out, it wasn't so much what you were carrying or what you were doing, but how you would move through things would affect what happened when you went through the shimmering wall, depending on where you came from. And I think that puzzle was hard because it wasn't obvious that was going on. And I guess one of the things that was hard for me writing it was wanting to describe it in a way that would lead you maybe to think about that kind of solution without giving it away.
So you'll notice that even Mark cannot explain how that puzzle actually worked. I remember the first time I tried it, I eventually stumbled on the answer. And I came out to him and I said, "Mark, what happened? You have to end up in a vault, and it involves going through, as he said, kind of the right sequence of rooms to get in. It remembered where you had been, and that determined where you went the next time you did something." And so he explained it to me, and he drew a little diagram, and I said, "Oh, okay, okay." And then someone else tried it and asked me, because I had played it, and I said, "I'm not sure I can explain it." And I tried, and they said, "Oh, really?" And so we went to Mark again, and he explained it again. And we said, "Oh, really?" I don't think anyone, even Mark, ever has successfully explained how it actually works. But it was a fun puzzle, just really hard. So here's some screenshots from Zork II. The ones on the left are from, I think, from Apple IIs, and the one on the right is from an Amiga, so a much later machine that didn't even exist at the time. But they give a sort of flavor of what is going on. The worst thing is that wizard. Down at the bottom left, you can see him casting the spell fantasize on you. All of his spells began with Fs. And the obvious one you're thinking of wasn't in the game. And fantasize, I think, was like an acid trip or something. Here's the Zork Users Group Zork II map. All of these maps and hint books were illustrated by a friend of ours, an artist named Dave Ardito, who did some really fun work with them. And you can see Zork II has a lot of stuff in it. On the upper left, you've got the Bank of Zork. On the bottom right, you've got the baseball maze. On the bottom center, you've got what we called Alice Land, which was a sort of Alice in Wonderland type scenario. And those were all from the mainframe game. And then in the bottom left, you've got the Wizard's Workshop, which was new. You've got a glacier puzzle that was new. There were a lot of things that were added. You've got a very nice puzzle with a topiary garden and a unicorn and a princess, and all of that was new. So it was about half old, half new stuff. And so again, the right-wrong thing. Bank of Zork was too hard. Baseball maze was a bad puzzle. We had adventure game physics. You could inflate an entire hot air balloon by burning a newspaper. But, that's what adventure games are for. Bad physics. Things that were good, we actually introduced magic. We had the wizard, We were self-publishing. And we were having so much fun self-publishing because we got input into the packaging. No barbarians, get rid of them. And then we moved to 55 Wheeler Street, which was the first time we had actually been anywhere other than in our own homes. And Wheeler Street brought people together.
Working at Wheeler Street was great because we were actually together rather than together sometimes or together at someone's house or something like that. We could actually work together and say, hey, come over here and look at this. I don't understand why this isn't working. Or ooh, I have an idea, and actually write it and let the other person walk over to your office and see it. And so that made a big, big difference, I think, in terms of productivity. Well, certainly in terms of productivity, but I think also in terms of quality of the games, because there's much quicker feedback, whether it was with testers or with collaborators, like when I was working with Dave. I think it's hard to do any creative project entirely by yourself of this sort because it's hard to get the feedback. I think Deadline, which was for the most part written at my apartment in Medford, I think would have been a better game if there'd been more opportunity to have other people there while I was writing it and actually playing with it and seeing it at the time. So I think you miss something working that way. So having the office, I think, was good. It also gave everyone, I think, more a sense of, permanence, that this was a real thing that we could keep taking seriously. I mean, it wasn't just like a lark that we were doing, but that we were trying to build something.
There's the Zork III cover. You'll notice the sameness among the three Zork covers, aside from the three and the little tagline on the top. It's called Establishing a Brand, I think. And again, some sheets of Mark's design of Zork III. You'll notice our designs were very simple. It was just handwritten on line printer paper or, sheets of note paper or whatever, and you sort of show them around and people would read them and say, oh, yeah, that seems pretty good. Why don't you do that? So we were actually doing a little bit of design in Zork 2 and Zork 3 because we had new puzzles. Zork 3, however, had another thing that was different. Instead of just design, he had a different idea of what you wanted to do in a game. It's not a dungeon crawl. Ooh, I pick up the microphone, 50 points. I pick up the gold bar, 100 points. I kill the troll, 8 points. It was more about how you exhibit the characteristics that make you not only a good person, but in the end, a fitting replacement for the dungeon master. Because instead of an antagonist, a true antagonist like the Wizard of Forbaz in Zork 2, the antagonist, sort of, is the dungeon master. The guy who is, in theory, running the great underground empire, is responsible for, well, really all the bad things that happen to you, but in any case, he's in charge of the place. And so by the end of Zork 3, you, in theory, should be fit to replace him. And that was what Mark was trying to write. So it's not killing things, it's cooperation, it's trusting people, it's doing things that make you a better person, as opposed to a better Conan the Barbarian type. Again, some more screenshots. Mostly you'll see that this was, over time, all that really seemed to evolve a little bit was the look of the score line. And that's probably because it's from an Amiga anyway. And a Zork 3 map, if you count them up, you'll see it's a slightly smaller layout than Zork 2, but not very much smaller. And again, it uses the last bits of the mainframe game. The thing in the lower right is what was called the Royal Puzzle in Zork 3, originally the Chinese puzzle. And in the upper right is the so-called end game, where you make your way down into the realm of the dungeon master and solve the final puzzles to win the game. And most of the rest was brand new stuff. Right and wrong. It's a story. The dungeon master was pretty cool. You only began to realize after a while that it was actually, he was the same person every time you encountered him. Had this innovative scoring. The winning score was like 9 points. Previously, there had been an advertising thing for adventure game companies to say, we have an adventure game with 300 points, 400 points, 500 points. And Mark kind of said, how about 9 points? That sounds good. So, there was also a great time travel puzzle. Now, I'm sort of into time travel puzzles and did a few of my own later. And I think there were 3 or 4 or 5 Infocom games that had time travel puzzles. We all liked them. Zork III was too small. That's just a personal opinion because I wanted more of it. And there was one, that so-called Chinese puzzle, royal puzzle, was really just a blocks moving game, which is a thing you can do in the real world. And I personally, I mean, all these rights and wrongs are my personal opinions, not anything real. I kind of like real puzzles in the real world, but I don't like them in games as much. But again, that's just me. So, and here is the complete works of Infocom in time order. So you can see Zork I, Zork II happened. Zork I was 1980, Zork II was 1981, and at about the same time, Deadline, which was our first mystery, came out. Then Mark was doing Zork III while I was doing Starcross, which was our first science fiction game, and they came out at more or less the same time. And just on and on and on, all the way down to 1988 and 1989 for the last four games, I guess, no, three. When we, as it were, the Cambridge office of Activision was moved to the West Coast. The people were not, but the office was. So what I mostly want to do here is thank some people, the other three implementers, Tim and Mark and Bruce, and Joel Perez, Mike Dornbrook, and Steve Moretsky, and everyone else at Infocom, but Joel in particular for being in those interviews, Mike and Steve for being the original Infocom testers, the most prolific writer in the case of Steve. Mike became our director of marketing eventually. They contributed more to Infocom individually than almost any other person that you could name. And so they get a thanks. And then I want to thank Rick Thornquist, who I'm describing as an archivist here, who has provided the videos and a lot of the scans that I've shown here. And he is doing a book about Infocom. I'm not sure when it will come out, but he's got some great material. And any questions? Don't have to be. Okay, I think the gentleman here on the left was the first one to get to a mic. Is that on? Okay, that's a two-part question since the mic wasn't on. The question was, what are my thoughts on stories in games and my advice for people trying to put stories in games? And second, what does a grue look like? The first one has a sort of long answer and a short answer. The shortest answer is that writing stories is very hard, and writing games that are stories is even harder unless, well, what happens is you tend to get on a railroad track. You know, you're programming the player to experience the story that you have in mind, whereas the player may have some different idea. And the example I always use, which is getting a little old, I guess, is what happens if in the first act of Hamlet, Hamlet says, I don't believe in no ghosts, man. My dad isn't there. You know, forget it. I'm going to go back to England and go back, or Wittenberg, and go back to school. Things are weird here in Denmark. And I don't think Shakespeare had that particular choose-your-own-adventure branch worked out. Actually, there's a great webcomic. I've forgotten it's called Dinosaur Comics, but the author of it created a choose-your-own-adventure for Hamlet. And it had a huge Kickstarter for it, and Hamlet could choose what to do. Ophelia, you could play Hamlet, you could play Ophelia, you could play Claudius, you could do all kinds of stuff. And so I guess in some sense my answer is incorrect, but anyway, the short answer is it's really hard to do that. And as for what grues look like, I think grues were actually portrayed at some point in one of the later post-Infocom Activision versions of Zork, Return to Zork or the other one. However, it was incorrect. It was not what they looked like if they were in there. And if I knew what a grue looked like, that would be kind of a logical impossibility, because if I knew what a grue looked like, I would be dead. Okay. Yeah.
First, I'd like to thank you for inspiring me to learn how to type, and then also inspiring me for my 15-year career in the games industry. So thanks for that.
Thank you very much.
My other question is, I saw a screenshot up there which had an Emacs editor.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, Emacs, VI preference?
Let's see, if I built entire games, well, actually, back in the day, it was before Emacs. It was still in Tico when Emacs was a giant mass of Tico macros that would fill this room if it was printed out. And we used a variation of that giant mass, a slightly less giant mass called R mode. But it was very Emacs-like, and Emacs was very much like it. And so I am definitely an Emacs guy. Absolutely. Yes! Thank you. VI types. Out. I do use VI every now and then. I can say :WQ. Okay.
So a most straightforward question. You said at the beginning, Zork, it was very difficult to make because of memory, and Zork I-III was more difficult because it wasn't a dungeon crawler. So what do you think? What was the most difficult Zork games to make, and maybe the most fun too for you?
Well, that requires a little explanation. The next Zork, Zork IV, there was actually a scene in Zork III that was ostensibly from Zork IV, and it involved you being sacrificed to some elder god at an altar. And that Zork IV became a different game called Enchanter, which was the first game in our Magic trilogy, Enchanter, Sorcerer, and Spellbreaker. And Mark and I wrote Enchanter, and Steve Moretsky wrote Sorcerer, and I wrote Spellbreaker. And in Enchanter, you see that same scene, so you begin to realize that that's really a continuation of the Zork series. And probably our marketing people, in retrospect, wish we had done it that way. Zork IV, Zork V, Zork VI, Zork 337. But we didn't. And so that's a long way of saying my favorite game of all the ones I've written was Enchanter. I mean, I didn't write it all entirely myself. Mark Plank, of course, was a big contributor as well. But it had a magic system in it that was new. Well, it was sort of like the D&D magic system or the Jack Vance magic system. It had a magic system. It had some great puzzles. It had some good writing. It had some fun characters. You got to meet the adventurer from the earlier Zorks because you were now playing Magician. So that was my favorite of all the games I wrote. And the hardest would have to have been Spellbreaker, because it was again another magic game, but it was incredibly complicated. It was one of the last games to be in the 64K code limit. We came up with a way of making the code limit 128K later. And it was hard to fit it all in, and it had a lot of complicated stuff going on. That was, for me, that was the toughest one to do.
Okay, thank you.
Hi. I think that the language and the humor of so many Infocom games, and Zork in particular, is just indelible in my mind, and I never thought I'd be able to thank anyone for it. So thank you and all those involved. And I do have a question. So after I finished playing the games, being a young kid, I would spend hours just screwing around with the parser, basically swearing at the game and saying things like "take troll," and the troll would say, "Oh, how romantic," or the game would say, "Oh, romantic." So I was wondering, did that emerge from you all just screwing around with the game, or was it something that was conscious?
There were several reasons for it. One was we were a bunch of wise asses. Secondly, we could, on the mainframe, and of course at Infocom when we had testers, we could watch people playing. On the mainframe, you could literally watch them playing. In fact, you could even inject things in the game as it was going on, which Mark loved to do. He would move things around in the maze, things like that. But we could see how they were interacting, and if they tried something and got a default response, like, you know, if you said take troll and it said you can't take that, very boring. So someone, me or Tim or Mark or Bruce, I don't even remember who put that one in, but somebody would come in and say, okay, if it's take on the troll, then give a better sarcastic response. Like there was one of my favorites, which we didn't end up taking out, but if you tried to dig with something other than an actual shovel, it would say digging with the whatever it was is slow and tedious. And it turned out that a thing you could dig with had the so-called tool bit on it. You know, I was talking about those bits. So the shovel had the tool bit. Now, it also was the case that your hands had the tool bit. So if you said dig with hands, or just dig because it would look for things with the tool bit and say, oh, he must mean that, it would say digging with the hands is slow and tedious. And after that, that became an expression around the company for doing anything that was incredibly boring. So yes, it was entirely deliberate. If we saw these things, or if our testers saw them, you know, once we had we had Steve Moretzky, who's one of the funniest guys in the world, and Mike Dornbrook, who is incredibly meticulous, both noticing these things when they were our testers. And then we had a full-time professional testing corps later. So whenever they found something like that and pointed out, if there was room to put it in the game, which there sometimes wasn't, we would put it in.
Thank you.
Was just curious, you mentioned Graham Nelson earlier. When Curses and then later Inform was released, I was just curious what you guys, the implementers, kind of, here's a guy who reverse engineered our stuff, is making basically a brand new Infocom game. Of course, there was magnetic scrolls and all that stuff, but this was like a single, like, Oxford mathematician, poetry editor. I was just curious what kind of the response to that was.
Well, let's see. Starting from the end and working back, we loved magnetic scrolls. We had a good relationship with them. They were nice people. And as for Graham, it was a whole team of people who reverse engineered it. He wrote a compiler of with his own idiosyncratic idea of how to write a language that reverse engineered our stuff. And it was like, I think, personally, I was incredibly flattered that they had done this. It was like what happened when a guy at Digital Equipment Corporation broke into the machine at MIT, you know, hacked into the machine in today's standards, and stole the source code for the mainframe Zork and translated it into Fortran so that it could be distributed by the DEC users group thing. We were flattered. It was not like, ooh, competitors, or ooh, what an evil person. It was like an homage or an honor that somebody cared enough to do that. That's how I felt, anyway. Okay, it looks kind of, oh, wait a minute, somebody's getting up.
I'm wondering what you think. Today, the computers can do so much more than they could back then. The memory is so massive, the speed is so much faster. Do you ever think about what you could create now, and would, I mean, obviously it'd be so hard to scale up, but I'm just curious what you thought about that.
Well, I think trying to scale up the kind of game we did, which was heavily based on, well, first the idea of being able to parse natural language sentences, and second, the idea of creating all these puzzles and making them interact properly and stuff. You could keep doing that. There are better English parsers out there, or could be, than the ones we did and all that. And people are sort of playing with that in Inform and other venues. So you could do it. I'm not sure it's, at this point, more than sort of an antiquarian pursuit. But I love seeing things like Curses, to be honest. It's fun.
Of change from then is so great. Nothing's really taken advantage of the capability of today's computers to the extent it could, but it would take massive work to do it. But
yeah, well, today's computers spend most of their time and energy pushing graphics around, and the result is pretty magnificent as graphics goes, and in some cases, it's pretty magnificent even in terms of story. There have been some games recently that have really reintroduced story into, they even sometimes call them adventure games, like, The Walking Dead and The Last of Us are kind of adventure games. They're not quite our style, but they have a lot of stuff in common with ours. And they don't really try to push the envelope too far on graphics, but I think they've done a pretty good job of gameplay. Okay. Looks pretty quiet. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for coming.